Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very, very slow walk through the back streets of ancient Rome, not to see the Colosseum or the Senate, but to visit a place far more essential to daily life, the public bakery. Forget what you know about charming cafes with Wi-Fi and artisanal sourdough. This is a world of stone, sweat, and social rules so subtle that a tourist like you or me would probably get tossed out for looking at someone the wrong way. It's a place where a loaf of bread says more about you than your clothes do. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means the world. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what city you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is cold, colder than you expected. It's that deep, damp cold that seeps up from the cobblestones and into your bones. There's no sun yet, just a faint, bruised purple hue to the east, promising a dawn that still feels an hour away. You're standing in a narrow alley in the Subur district, a place crowded with towering, rickety apartment blocks called insulae. The silence here is a myth. It's just a different kind of noise. The daytime roar of vendors and politicians is replaced by a pre-dawn symphony. The most dominant sound is the rumble of heavy wooden wheels on stone. This is rush hour for the supply carts. One of the great mainstream facts of Roman life is that wheeled traffic was largely banned from the city center during daylight hours to prevent gridlock. So now in the dark is when the city truly moves. A cart laden with amphorae of wine groans past you, its driver muttering curses at his stubborn ox. The sound is deafening in the narrow street, echoing off the plaster walls. You pull your rough wool cloak tighter around you and start walking. Your goal is the smell. It's faint at first, almost lost beneath the other scents of the waking city. The sharp tang of charcoal smoke from 1,000 braziers, the earthy smell of damp tufa stone, and the less romantic, ever-present aroma of the city's drainage system. But as you navigate the maze of streets, another scent begins to assert itself. It's warm, yeasty, and deeply comforting. The smell of baking bread. This is your compass this morning. As you walk, you notice the other figures moving in the shadows. They are not senators or generals. They are the city's engine. A man hurries past with a long pole over his shoulder, from which hang several clucking chickens. A woman balances a large basket of laundry on her head, her steps sure and practiced even on the uneven stones. This is the Rome that doesn't end up on coins or in epic poems. Here is a little piece of odd trivia for you. Some of the people you see stooping in the darkest corners are the stercarari, the city's official dung collectors. They gathered animal and human waste to sell to farmers as fertilizer. It was a recognized, if not respected, profession, an essential, unseen part of the urban machine. You give them a wide berth. The debate among historians, which still simmers today, is about just how absolute that daytime cart ban was. Was it a blanket rule, or could a merchant with a well-placed bribe to a member of the vigils the city watch get his cart of expensive Spanish olive oil through the forum at midday? Evidence suggests that, like most rules in a city of 1 million people, it was probably negotiable. The law was a guideline. A handful of coins was the real permit. You turn a corner, and the smell of bread intensifies, overwhelming everything else. It's a beacon. Ahead, you see a soft, flickering orange light spilling out from a low doorway, painting the cobblestones in front of it with a warm glow. You hear a rhythmic, grinding sound from within, punctuated by the occasional bray of a donkey and the low murmur of voices. You've found it. Not just any bakery, but the one you were told about. The one with the good flour. You pause at the threshold, gathering your courage. The real challenge is about to begin. It's not about buying bread. It's about navigating the unwritten rules of the oven. You linger in the doorway for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the dim, hazy interior. The air inside is a physical presence. It's thick with heat, moisture, and the fine, almost invisible dust and flour that hangs in the air, catching the flickering light of the oil lamps and the distant glow of the oven. This isn't a shop in the modern sense, with a welcoming counter and neat displays. It's a workshop, a machine powered by muscle and fire, and you're stepping directly into its gears. Finding the right bakery in Rome wasn't like scrolling through online reviews. Your choice was a complex calculation of social cues. The first thing to check is the sign, the signum. Not every bakery had one, but the more established ones did. You look up. Above this particular doorway, there isn't a brightly painted sign, but a simple weathered relief carved into the stone lintel. It depicts a donkey patiently turning a large millstone. This is the universal symbol of a pistrinum, a bakery that grinds its own grain. It's a mark of quality. It means the flour is fresh, not bought from some questionable wholesaler down by the docks. This is a mainstream, reliable indicator you've come to a decent place. But the sign is only the beginning. The real information comes from the people. There's no orderly queue, just a small, shifting cluster of individuals near the entrance. You recognize the types. There's a slave you can tell by his simple tunic and the calm, almost bored expression on his face. He's holding a small, clean cloth bag. His master is likely a wealthy equestrian who lives nearby, and this slave's daily task is to procure the best bread. The fact that he's here and not at a cheaper place tells you this bakery is trusted by the upper classes. Standing a little apart from him is a freeman, a plebeian. His cloak is more patched than yours, and he clutches not a bag, but a small, lumpy mass of dough resting on a wooden board. He's here to use the oven, not to buy the baker's bread. He can't afford his own oven in his tiny apartment, so he pays a small fee to the baker, the pister, to have his homemade dough baked for him. His presence tells you this bakery also serves the common folk. It's a community hub, not an exclusive establishment. Here's a curious little detail. You also learn to judge a bakery by its smell. beyond the obvious scent of bread. A good bakery has a clean smell of fire and grain. A bad one has a faint, sour undertone, a hint of old flour, or, even worse, the smell of burnt offerings, which meant the baker was clumsy, and his oven temperature was unreliable. Some historians even suggest you could judge a baker by the health of the donkey tied up outside. A well-fed, placid animal suggested a prosperous and careful owner. This brings us to a fascinating point of academic debate. How much did written language matter on these commercial signs? While the symbol of the millstone was universal, some bakeries would have the owner's name carved alongside it. For instance, the bakery of Gaius Julius Proculus. Historians argue to this day about the functional literacy of the average Roman. Could the plebeian with his lump of dough read that name? Or did he rely solely on the symbol, the location, and word of mouth? The consensus is leaning towards a world where symbols and reputation were far more powerful than text. The name was for official records and for the literate elite. The image and the quality of the crowd were the real advertisements for everyone else. You scan the walls outside the bakery. They are covered in graffiti, a chaotic mix of scratched charcoal messages. One crudely drawn picture shows a man with a huge smile holding a round loaf. Next to it, someone else has written in rough Latin, "The bread is good, but Sextus is a thief." This public feedback system was the closest thing Rome had to a comments section. Based on the signs, the carved millstone, the high-status slave, the humble freeman, and the generally positive graffiti, you make your decision. This place is busy, but not chaotic. It's respected, but not pretentious. This is the one. You take a slow, deliberate breath, the warm, flowery air filling your lungs, and step over the stone threshold, out of the cool dawn and into the dense, noisy warmth of the Roman bakery. The rhythmic grinding you heard from the street is now a deep, resonant bass note that vibrates through the soles of your thin leather sandals and up into your chest. It's the heartbeat of this place. In the center of the large, open room, a beast and a machine are locked in a slow, eternal dance. This is the Mola Azenaria, the donkey-driven mill, and it's a masterpiece of Roman engineering and a monument to relentless labor. You watch, fascinated. The mill is made of two massive hourglass-shaped stones. The bottom stone, the meta, is a fixed cone rising from a stone platform. The top stone, the catalyst, is a hollowed-out double cone that fits over it, creating a narrow gap where the magic happens. A heavy wooden frame is clamped around the upper stone, and attached to this frame is a long horizontal beam. Harnessed to the end of that beam is a donkey. The animal plods in a perfect, endless circle. Its steps are slow, deliberate, and utterly devoid of enthusiasm. Its fur is dull and worn in patches where the leather harness has rubbed for years. And here you notice a strange and slightly sad detail, a common practice in Roman bakeries. The donkey is blindfolded. A strip of grubby cloth is tied securely around its eyes. This is a practical, if melancholy, piece of ancient tech. The blindfold prevents the donkey from getting dizzy from its circular path, but more importantly, It stops it from trying to nibble at the grain that a young boy is steadily pouring into the top of the catalyst. The animal doesn't need to see. It just needs to walk. As your eyes trace the path, you see that not all the mills are powered by animals. In a darker corner, another mill is being pushed by two men. Their bodies are lean and muscular, glistening with a thin sheen of sweat despite the morning chill. Their movements are just as mechanical as the donkeys. Turning the mill was a common punishment for slaves, a task so grueling it was considered a form of slow-motion sentence. The sound in the room isn't just stone on stone. It's the soft scuff of a hoof, the whisper of a bare foot on the dusty floor, a shared rhythm of toil. This is where you touch upon a subject that historians still argue about with quiet intensity: the treatment of these living engines. Was the donkey or the slave at the mill seen as anything more than a disposable part? Writers like Cato the Elder, in his famous treatise on agriculture, advised landowners to sell off old oxen, sick slaves, and worn-out tools without a second thought. This suggests a brutal, unsentimental pragmatism. A living being was an asset, and when it depreciated, you got rid of it. Yet other evidence complicates this picture. Archaeological finds of bakeries like those preserved so perfectly in Pompeii sometimes show evidence of care. There are dedicated spaces for the animals, and some bakers surely understood that a well-fed, reasonably healthy donkey would grind more flour for longer than a starved and abused one. The debate, then, is not about whether the life was hard, it was undeniably brutal, but about the line between cold calculus and basic animal husbandry. Was the baker's kindness, if any existed, born of empathy or just good business sense? We can analyze skeletons for stress fractures, but we can't excavate the owner's intent. The sound of the grind changes slightly, becoming finer, smoother. The slave boy adjusts the rate at which he pours the grain. The baker, a burly man with flour dusting his thick beard and forearms, walks over and runs a pinch of the resulting flour through his fingers. He nods slowly. The quality of the grind determined the quality of the bread, and thus its price. This slow, patient crushing produced the fine white flour for the panes siligineus, the expensive bread destined for the tables of the rich. A quicker, coarser grind would yield gritty, darker flour for the cheap, dense loaves that would feed the masses. The social hierarchy of Rome was being ground into existence right here in this dusty, noisy room. Your attention shifts from the ceaseless turning of the mill. The baker's assistant takes a wide, shallow wooden shovel and scoops a mound of the freshly ground, surprisingly warm flour into a massive trough in the corner of the room. A new stage is beginning, and with it, a new set of social dynamics. The flour, scooped from the base of the mill, now sits in a long, shallow stone trough. Another man, leaner than the baker, but just as dusted and white, begins to work. He pours water from a clay jug, his movements economical and precise. He is a slave, but a skilled one. His task is to mix and knead, to transform the inert powder into a living, breathing dough. The social hierarchy of the bakery now comes into sharper focus, moving from the machinery to the men. At the top of this small pyramid is the baker, the pister. He stands with his arms crossed, a mountain of a man with a thick neck and hands that look like they could crush stone. His tunic is a better quality than his workers', but it's still a working man's garment, stained with sweat and old dough. He is the master of this domain, an owner, a small businessman. His word here is absolute law. He's a well-known figure in the neighborhood, essential to everyone's survival, and yet he occupies a strange place in the Roman social ladder. He's respected for his product, but faintly disdained for his trade. To work with your hands for a living, to be perpetually covered in the grime of your labor, was not the Roman ideal of a gentleman. Below him are the slaves. You see the distinction clearly. The men turning the mill are laborers, their bodies conditioned for one repetitive, brutal task. The man at the trough is an artisan, his value lying in his skill. He knows the feel of the dough, how much water to add on a humid day versus a dry one. He might have been born in the baker's household or been purchased specifically for this talent. His life is better than the mill turner's, but his freedom is just as absent. He works without speaking, his focus entirely on the trough. Then there are the customers, the constellation of figures you observed from the outside. Now, inside the bakery, you begin to understand their silent language. The wealthy equestrian slave stands patiently, almost aloof. He makes no move to approach the baker. He knows his place, and he knows his master, as bread will be of the highest quality and will be ready when it is ready. He holds his fine linen bag, perhaps embroidered with his master's initials, a subtle signal of status. This is a cold, hard fact of Roman life. In many public spaces, a high-status slave carried more implicit authority than a low-status freeborn citizen. In stark contrast is the freeman you saw earlier. He shuffles his feet, shifting his weight from one leg to the other, his eyes darting nervously towards the baker. He clutches his wooden board with its precious lump of homemade dough, as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He is not here as a representative. His hunger is his own. He needs the baker's oven, and that makes him subservient. Here's a peculiar, almost invisible rule you start to notice. No one speaks out of turn. The interactions are governed by a complex dance of eye contact and posture. This is where the true social sorting happens. The baker might grunt a question to the high-status slave, but he will wait for the poor freeman to approach him, and even then, he might ignore him for a few moments just to reinforce the pecking order. This brings us to one of the most fascinating debates among historians of Roman daily life, perfectly embodied by the baker himself. Could a man like this, a tradesman, ever truly climb the social ladder? We have the spectacular tomb of Marcus Vergilius Eurysaces, a baker and contractor from the late Republic. It's a massive, bizarrely shaped monument right outside Rome's Porta Maggiore, decorated with friezes showing every stage of the bread-making process, and topped with cylinders that look like grain measures or dough-mixing vessels. This man was clearly obscenely wealthy, but was he respected? Academics are split. Some see his tomb as a proud monument to a successful entrepreneur, a man who transcended his humble origins through hard work, the Roman dream, in a sense. Others see it as a desperate new money display, a garish attempt to buy a legacy that the old aristocratic families would have seen as profoundly tacky and undignified. Was Ulysses celebrated in the Senate, or was he mocked behind his back at their dinner parties? His money was real, but his status remains a ghost, a question mark haunting his ostentatious grave. The baker glances in your direction. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, seem to assess you in a single sweeping look. He takes in your cloak, your sandals, your uncertain posture. You are a new face. You are not a regular. You have no dough on a board, no fine linen bag. You are an anomaly. His gaze lingers for a second, a silent question hanging in the hot, flowery air. What do you want? You feel the weight of the baker's stare. In this small, crowded space there is no formal line, no neat, roped-off queue, like you might imagine. There's just the cluster, that amoeba-like group of people near the front, and it operates on an invisible, unspoken set of rules that are as rigid as any law carved in bronze. This is the art of Roman queuing, and it's a master class in social navigation. Your first instinct, the modern one, would be to ask, who's next? This would be a catastrophic mistake. It would mark you instantly as an outsider, someone who doesn't understand how the world works. Here, your place in line is not determined by when you arrived, but by who you are. The highest-ranking person gets served first, period. It's a fundamental principle of Roman public life. The baker turns his attention back to his work, but his assessment of you is complete. He has placed you in the hierarchy. You are clearly not a slave, but your cloak is not the fine wool of a senator's household. You are likely a common citizen, a plebeian, but one he doesn't recognize. This puts you near the bottom of the invisible list. You watch the dance. The equestrian slave doesn't need to push or shove. He simply stands with an air of patient authority. When the first batch of fine, white bread is ready, pulled from the oven on a long wooden paddle, the baker will catch the slave's eye. A subtle nod is exchanged. The slave will step forward. The transaction will happen quickly and quietly, and he will depart. No fuss, no wasted words. His master's status is cued for him. The freeman with the dough board has a much harder task. He needs to assert his presence without being disrespectful. He edges slightly closer to the kneading trough, trying to catch the baker's eye at an opportune moment. He cannot interrupt the baker while he's inspecting a batch, nor can he speak before the high-status slave has been dealt with. His strategy is one of patient proximity. He must make himself visible, a silent reminder of his needs, until the baker deigns to acknowledge him. It's a delicate, nerve-wracking performance. Here you stumble upon a wonderful, quirky detail about Roman social interaction, the importance of the nomenclator, and the world of the ultra-rich. An aristocrat would employ a special slave whose only job was to remember the names and faces of everyone his master might meet in the forum. He would whisper reminders in his master's ear. That is Marcus. His uncle is a senator. He lent you money last year. It was a human social cheat sheet. Down here in the bakery, there is no nomenclator, but the baker performs a similar function. He is the master of his own small universe. He knows who owes him money, whose wife is a notorious gossip, who is newly prosperous, and who is on the verge of ruin. This institutional memory is part of the queuing system. A loyal customer, even a poor one, might get a nod before a wealthier stranger. This brings us to a perennially debated question among social historians. How much agency did the common Roman plebe have in these daily interactions? Were they just passive recipients of the social order, always waiting for their turn after the elites? Or did they have subtle ways of pushing back? The evidence is tantalizingly ambiguous. We have graffiti like the one you saw outside, cursing the baker. This is a form of anonymous rebellion. We have records of grain riots and protests when the supply failed, showing that their patience had a limit. Some scholars argue that the queue-less system was, in its own way, a theater for minor acts of defiance. A witty remark at the right moment, a shared joke with another customer, or a well-timed compliment about the smell of the bread could subtly improve your position. It was a fluid system, not entirely set in stone. Your social standing gave you your starting position, but a little bit of charm or cleverness, what the Romans called urbanitis, could perhaps let you jump the line by 1 or 2 places. It was a small victory, but in a world of rigid hierarchies, a small victory was everything. You decide on your strategy. You will do what the freeman is doing. You find a spot against the wall, not too close to the action, but not so far away that you become part of the scenery. You try to look patient, respectful, and, most importantly, local. You are not here to challenge the system. You are here to work within it. You will wait for a sign, a glance, a pause in the rhythm of the work. Only then will you make your move. For now, you watch, you listen, and you learn the silent, powerful language of the Roman line. The baker, having dispatched the equestrian slave with a silent, efficient exchange, finally turns his gaze towards the lower status customers. His eyes pass over the freeman with the dough board. His transaction will be different and land on you. He doesn't speak. He simply raises his thick, flour-dusted eyebrows in a silent, universal gesture. Well, now that the moment is here, you're transfixed by the product of all this labor, cooling on a wooden rack near the oven. The sheer variety is not in elaborate shapes or styles, but in color and texture, and each one tells a story. This is the core, mainstream knowledge of Roman bread culture. The loaf you choose defines you. On one side are the loaves of Panis Silligenius. They are beautiful, almost perfectly round, with a pale, golden-brown crust, scored on top into 8 neat wedges. This scoring wasn't just for decoration. It was a practical measure to make the loaf easy to break and share. This is the bread of the wealthy. It's made from the finest sifted wheat flour, the kind you saw being so carefully ground earlier. It would be light, airy, and soft. To buy this bread without the social standing to back it up would be an act of profound arrogance. It would be like showing up to a construction site in a silk toga. You might have the money for it today, but everyone in the room would know you were pretending. On the other side is the panis sordidus, or panis plebeius, the bread of the people. These loaves are darker, heavier, and more rustic. They are made from whole grain flour, sometimes mixed with cheaper grains like spelt or barley, and they contain all the bran and grit that was sifted out of the fancy flour. It's a dense, chewy, substantial bread. It's honest. It promises to fill your belly and fuel a day of hard work, nothing more. This is the bread a man of your apparent station is expected to buy. But then your eye catches something else, a detail that speaks to the baker's skill and the weirdness of ancient cuisine. There are a few, even darker, flatter loaves, flecked with what looks like seeds. Here's a bit of odd trivia for you. Roman bakers, especially those with access to diverse ingredients, would sometimes make specialty breads. Some might be flavored with poppy seeds or fennel, but the truly strange ones were regional recipes like panis picenus. This was a bread mentioned by Pliny the Elder, made from acorn flour. Yes, acorns. The flour was leached of its bitterness for 9 days, then kneaded with a little salt and anise, and shaped into loaves that were then baked on earthenware shards, often after being soaked in milk to soften them. It was a holdover from a much older pre-wheat era, a piece of culinary history still being baked and sold in the corners of the city. This is where you wade into one of the great historical debates surrounding Roman society, the grain dole or the cura annone. As you stare at the humble panis plebeius, you wonder where its flour came from. For centuries, the Roman state provided its citizens with a monthly ration of grain, either for free or at a heavily subsidized price. Historians are still locked in a fierce debate about the true purpose of this system. Was it an early form of social welfare, a genuine attempt by the state to ensure its massive, often unemployed urban population didn't starve? Proponents of this view point to the stability it created, preventing the kind of food riots that had toppled governments in other eras. Or was it a cynical tool of social control, a way to keep the restless plebeian masses docile and dependent on the emperor's generosity? This bread and circuses argument suggests the dole was less about compassion and more about political calculation, keeping the mob fed and entertained so they wouldn't concern themselves with politics. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a complex mix of both. The flour in that humble loaf might be a symbol of imperial charity, or a link in a chain of political subjugation. The baker is still waiting. His patience is not infinite. You can't stand here all day in a philosophical haze. You have to make a choice that will place you firmly in the social fabric of this room. You look at the beautiful, aspirational white bread, and then at the dark, honest loaf of the common man. There is no real choice, not if you want to fit in. You point a slightly hesitant finger, not at the acorn bread, that's a conversation for another day, but at the dark, dense loaf. "That one," you managed to say, your voice sounding rough in the noisy room. The baker nods, his expression unreadable, and reaches for your chosen destiny. The baker takes your chosen loaf, a dense, dark round of panis plebeius, and sets it on the rough-hewn counter. Now that your own transaction is underway, your attention is drawn to the freeman who has been waiting so patiently with his dough board. The baker, having dealt with you, finally acknowledges him with a gruff, "Quid est?" "What is it?" The man shuffles forward, presenting his offering. He doesn't have a simple lump of dough. It's neatly shaped, already risen, and resting on a bed of cabbage leaves to prevent it from sticking to the board. This isn't just a convenience. It's a critical part of a system built on a foundation of mutual, if grudging, trust. This is the practice of bringing your panes domesticus, your home-prepared dough, to the communal oven. Most Romans living in the crowded insulae had no kitchen, let alone an oven. Cooking was done on a small portable charcoal brazier, which was a constant fire hazard. Baking a loaf of bread required a massive built-in oven, the furnace, which was far too large and dangerous for a tenement building. So for a small fee, the pister would rent out space in his oven. This was a cornerstone of Roman community life. You watch the baker inspect the man's dough. He pokes it with a floury finger, testing its texture and elasticity. This is the moment of judgment. The baker needs to ensure the dough is of decent quality. A poorly made dough too wet, too dry, or not properly kneaded won't bake properly. It could spread out and stick to other loaves in the crowded oven, or it might not rise at all, taking up valuable space for no reason. The baker's reputation is on the line with every loaf that comes out of his oven, even the ones he didn't mix himself. Here's a peculiar little detail that reveals the anxieties of this system. To ensure there were no mix-ups, or more accurately, no theft, bakers used bread stamps or signa pistoris. These were small, carved wooden or bronze stamps that were pressed into the top of the raw dough before it went into the oven. A customer might have their own personal stamp, perhaps with their initials or a simple symbol like an anchor or a star. The baker also had a master stamp for the bread he sold. This way, when dozens of similar-looking loaves emerged from the fiery depths of the oven, ownership was clear. It was an ancient analog version of labeling your lunch in the office fridge. But even with stamps, there was suspicion. The customer worried the baker might swap their good, well-made dough for an inferior one. Or worse, that the baker might shave the loaf, pinching off a small piece of their dough for himself before baking it. A tiny bit from each customer's dough could add up to a free loaf for the baker by the end of the day. This leads to a quiet, simmering debate among food historians. How widespread was this kind of petty cheating? Roman literature is full of jokes and complaints about dishonest tradesmen, with bakers being a frequent target. The satirist Juvenal wrote scathingly about the low quality of bread available to the poor. So was the stereotype of the thieving baker a reflection of a constant daily reality, or was it just an easy comedic trope? like complaining about lawyers or politicians today. The evidence is hard to parse. On one hand, the existence of the stamps themselves proves that trust was an issue. You don't invent a system to prevent a problem that doesn't exist. On the other hand, a baker's business relied entirely on his reputation within a small neighborhood. A baker known for cheating would quickly lose customers to a more honest competitor down the street. It's likely that most bakers were probably honest, but the fear of being cheated was a constant, low-level hum in the background of every transaction. The system worked, but it worked because everyone was watching everyone else. The baker seems satisfied with the freeman's dough. He grunts his approval and takes the board. He doesn't stamp it himself. Instead, he gestures towards a small wooden box on the counter. The freeman reaches in and pulls out his own personal stamp, a small worn piece of carved wood, and presses it firmly into the center of his doughy creation. He has marked his territory. The baker then slides the entire board onto a long-handled paddle and tells the man to come back in an hour. The ritual is complete. The dough is now in the hands of the oven, and the customer can only hope for the best. The baker, a man of few movements, places your loaf on the worn wooden counter. It lands with a soft, dense thud. The transaction isn't over. Now comes the delicate matter of payment. You reach into the small leather pouch tied to your belt, the place where you keep your worldly wealth. The price for a common loaf like this is known. A few asses, the basic bronze coins of the Roman world. You fumble for the small, surprisingly heavy coins. This is a fundamental aspect of Roman daily economics, the physicality of cash. There is no credit, no digital transfer. There is only the clink of metal on wood. The baker waits, his expression unchanging. His hands, caked with a permanent layer of flour, are surprisingly deft as he prepares to handle the money. The price of bread wasn't static. While your loaf today has a standard price, a bad harvest in Egypt or a storm delaying the grain fleet from Africa could cause prices to skyrocket overnight. This is a mainstream historical fact. The entire city of Rome, a metropolis of 1 million souls, was utterly dependent on these maritime supply lines. The emperor's first and most important job was to ensure the grain ships arrived safely and on time. A failure to do so meant not just hunger, but riots. As you place the coins on the counter, you notice a strange detail. Near the baker's elbow sits a small bowl of water. After he takes your coins, he dips his fingertips into the water for a second before turning back to his dough. This is a tiny, almost unconscious ritual of purification. He is moving from the dirty world of commerce, of handling money that has passed through 1,000 other grimy hands, back to the clean, almost sacred world of creating food. It's a practical act of hygiene, but it feels like more than that. This brings us to one of the most interesting and debated aspects of the Roman welfare system, the tesserae frumentaria. These were small tokens, usually made of clay or lead, which were distributed to eligible citizens and could be exchanged for a set amount of grain at official distribution points. Historians have long argued about how this system truly functioned in practice. Did a citizen take his Tesla to a giant state-run warehouse, receive a sack of raw wheat, and then have to find a miller to grind it and a baker to bake it? Or were there bakers who were authorized by the state to accept the tesserae directly in exchange for finished loaves? The evidence is murky. It's likely both systems existed. This creates a fascinating mental picture of two parallel economies running in the same bakery. One customer pays with bronze coins for a loaf made from the baker's own flour. The next might pay a smaller fee to have the bread from his state-allotted grain baked for him. This dual system highlights the complex relationship between private enterprise and state welfare in Rome. The baker wasn't just a shopkeeper. He was an essential cog in the vast machinery of imperial logistics. You push the correct number of coins across the counter. The baker sweeps them into his hand without counting, his experience telling him the weight and feel are right. He nods once. The transaction is complete. You take your loaf. It's still warm, a comforting weight in your hands. You've successfully navigated the purchase. Now, with your prize secured, you can afford to linger for a moment, to fade back into the background and simply observe the lifeblood of the city. Clutching your warm loaf of bread, you recede to a quieter corner of the bakery, becoming part of the scenery again. The immediate tension of the transaction has passed, and now you can tune into the room's other frequency, the low, constant murmur of conversation. The bakery isn't just a place to buy food. It's a node in the city's information network. This is the Roman version of social media, and you're watching the timeline scroll by in real time. A mainstream and crucial fact of Roman urban life is that news and rumors spread with incredible speed through its public spaces. With no newspapers or broadcast media for the general populace, the forum, the public baths, and neighborhood hubs like this bakery were where you learned what was going on. The information was a chaotic mix of fact, fiction, and outright speculation. You listen, pretending to inspect your loaf. Two women, waiting for their dough to be baked, are having a quiet but intense conversation. You catch snippets. One is complaining about her landlord, who has failed to fix a leaking roof in her insular apartment for the third time. The other woman nods sympathetically, then leans in to whisper that she heard the landlord lost a great deal of money on a bad shipment of wine, and he's paying no one. This isn't just idle gossip. It's vital economic intelligence for the neighborhood. Anyone dealing with that landlord now knows to be cautious. A little further away, a man is talking to the baker's assistant. He speaks in a low voice, but with animated gestures. You hear the words Legio Ix and Britannia. He's a veteran, you surmise, sharing news, or more likely, rumors from the frontier. Did a legion really vanish in the misty forests of Britain? The official news from the state would be tightly controlled, but here, in the bakery, the unfiltered, more exciting version of the story circulates freely among the common people. This brings you to a piece of wonderfully specific trivia. The Romans had a concept for this kind of chatter, rumors. But a rumor wasn't just a piece of gossip. It was a force of nature. Roman politicians knew that a well-placed rumor could destroy a rival's career or even incite a riot. They actively tried to manage the flow of information, but it was like trying to cup water in your hands. This leads directly to a serious and ongoing debate among historians. How pervasive was state surveillance in the lives of ordinary people? The city of Rome had its watch, the vigils, but they were primarily firefighters and police. Did the emperor employ a network of secret informers, the notorious delatores, to listen in on conversations in places like this? The writings of elite historians like Tacitus are filled with paranoia, describing a world where a careless word at a dinner party could lead to treason charges and execution. But did that atmosphere of fear trickle down to this bakery? Was the veteran worried that his talk of a lost legion could get him in trouble? Most scholars now believe that the intense scrutiny was focused on the senatorial class, the emperor's direct political rivals. For the common person, the plebeian, the state was a distant, powerful entity you tried to avoid, but you probably didn't censor your every word for fear of a spy lurking behind the flour sacks. The freedom to complain about your landlord was likely one of the small, unwritten rights of being a Roman. The baker is the center of this web. He hears everything: the political rumors, the neighborhood scandals, the price of fish down at the market. He is the keeper of the community's collective consciousness, absorbing and transmitting the 1,000 tiny stories that make up the life of the city. As you listen to the hum of gossip and complaint, your eyes keep drifting back to the baker himself. He is the sun around which this small solar system of customers revolves. He is essential, powerful in his own domain. Yet the whispers you overhear confirm a deep-seated Roman paradox. The man who feeds you is not to be fully trusted. This is the baker's gray reputation. The most common and mainstream accusation, a stereotype as old as Rome itself, was that of adulteration. You look at your own dark loaf. Is it made purely from coarsely ground wheat? Or, as the satirists and comedians would have you believe, has the baker stretched his expensive flour by mixing in cheaper, less wholesome ingredients? Ground fava beans were a common suspected additive, as was chalk dust to make the bread seem whiter and heavier, or even, in the most cynical jokes, sawdust. This fear of being cheated was a constant in Roman life. At the public markets and the forum, you would find an official set of weights and measures, the mensa ponderaria, carved into a stone block. A citizen who suspected a merchant had short-changed him could, in theory, march over and have his purchase officially weighed. The existence of these public scales proves that commercial dishonesty was a real and persistent problem. This leads to a quirky piece of historical trivia that turns a modern phrase on its head. We have the concept of a baker's dozen, meaning 13 instead of 12, as a gesture of generosity. The historical root of this is likely tied to the intense regulation of bakers in medieval times, but the underlying principle was born in places like this. A baker was so afraid of being accused of selling underweight loaves, a crime for which he could be heavily fined or flogged, that he would often throw in an extra small piece, a lagniappe, just to be safe. It wasn't about generosity. It was about avoiding punishment. The trust between baker and customer was so fragile that it had to be padded with an extra margin of error. The reputation of bakers was so notoriously poor that it created a fascinating historical debate. Was the stereotype a fair reflection of reality? The literary evidence, from plays to poems, is overwhelmingly negative. They paint a picture of a thieving, dirty, and dishonest profession. However, archaeological evidence complicates this narrative. Chemical analysis of perfectly preserved loaves of bread carbonized by the eruption of Vesuvius in Pompeii offers a direct window into the baker's bowl. What do these loaves contain? For the most part, scientists have found ... flour. The evidence for widespread, systematic adulteration with things like chalk or sawdust is very slim. So who do we believe? The angry poets or the silent, scientific proof of the bread itself? Most historians now lean towards a middle ground. The stereotype was likely an exaggeration, a convenient punchline for comedians, and a way for the upper classes to look down on manual laborers. While some bakers surely did cheat, the majority probably understood that their long-term survival depended on producing a consistent, reliable product for their neighbors. The reputation was likely worse than the reality. The baker wasn't necessarily a villain, but he was a perfect scapegoat for a society deeply anxious about its food supply. He stood at the choke point between a raw commodity and a finished, life-sustaining product, making him a natural target for suspicion. You look at the baker again. He catches your eye for a split second, and his face is not that of a thief, but of a tired man running a demanding business in a city that both needs and resents him. Pondering the baker's precarious social standing, you begin to realize that he isn't just an independent businessman. He's part of a larger structure, a formal organization that both protects and constrains him. This is the world of the Roman collegia, the trade guilds, and the Bakers' Guild was one of the most powerful and peculiar of them all. It's a well-known historical fact that many Roman professions were organized into these guilds. There were collegia for silversmiths, boatmen, doctors, and even undertakers. On the surface, they were part social club, providing a sense of community and ensuring members received a proper burial. They would have patron deities, shared feasts, and a formal leadership structure. But for trades essential to the state like the shippers who transported grain and the bakers who turned it into bread, these guilds took on a much more serious role. The baker you see before you is likely a member of the Collegium Pistorum. This membership gave him certain legal standings and protections, but it also came with heavy obligations, and this is where the history gets strange and fascinating. Here is a truly bizarre piece of trivia about the Bakers' Guild. By the time of the later Roman Empire, membership had become compulsory and hereditary. If you were a baker, your son was legally bound to become a baker. He could not choose another profession. If a man married a baker's daughter, He himself was often required to join his father-in-law's trade. The state, in its desperate need to ensure the stability of the bread supply for the massive population of Rome, essentially turned the bakers into a hereditary caste. They were granted significant privileges, such as exemption from taxes and certain military duties. But in exchange, they gave up their personal freedom and the freedom of their children. They were vital cogs in the state machine, and the state wasn't about to let those cogs wander off. The baker before you might be the master of his own shop, but his destiny and that of his family was chained to his oven by law. This unique status has fueled a long-standing academic debate. Were the collegia more like modern trade unions, or were they instruments of state control? The answer seems to change over time. In the early days of the Republic, they appear to have been voluntary associations formed for mutual benefit, much like a union. They might have collectively bargained for better contracts or protected their members from exploitation. But by the late Empire, their character had shifted dramatically. The state began to lean on them, integrating them into the administration of the grain dole. They became quasi-governmental agencies responsible for enforcing regulations and ensuring production quotas were met. The debate among historians is whether the guilds were willing partners in this arrangement, seeking the security and privileges the state offered, or if they were slowly and inexorably co-opted by an increasingly autocratic government. Did the baker see his hereditary obligation as a prestigious duty and a sign of his importance, or as a form of servitude in a gilded cage? Looking at the baker now, you see not just a man, but an institution. His personal identity is fused with his professional one. The flower on his arms is not just the dust of his daily work. It's the uniform of his legally mandated role in the survival of Rome. He is both a servant and a master, a free man and a captive of his own essential trade. Your gaze drifts from the baker to a dimly lit corner of the workshop, away from the heat of the oven and the dust of the mill. There, on a small wooden shelf, is a little shrine. It's nothing grand, just a few terracotta figurines and a small, flickering oil lamp that casts dancing shadows on the wall. This is the spiritual heart of the bakery, a quiet testament to the fact that baking was not just a craft, but an act intertwined with the divine. It's a mainstream fact of Roman life that religion was woven into the fabric of everything. There was no clear separation between the sacred and the secular. Every home had its lararium, a shrine to the household gods, the Lares and Penates, who protected the family. A business like a bakery, which was often part of the baker's home, was no different. It was the hearth of the neighborhood, and it needed its divine protectors. The most important deity here would undoubtedly be Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Her sacred fire, kept eternally burning in her temple in the Forum by the Vestal virgins, was the symbolic heart of the entire Roman state. The baker's oven was a small, domestic echo of that sacred flame. Keeping it lit, using its heat to provide nourishment, was a profoundly sacred act. The baker wasn't just baking bread. He was participating in a ritual that affirmed order, community, and life itself. But here is a wonderfully weird piece of trivia that delves deeper into the specifics of Roman religious belief. They didn't just have vista. The Romans had a habit of personifying everything, creating minor deities for specific functions. For the bakery, there was Fornax, the literal goddess of the oven. Fornax is the Latin word for oven. Each year in February, the Romans celebrated the Fornicalia, a festival in her honor, to ensure the grain was properly roasted and the bread baked true for the coming year. So the baker's morning prayer might not have been a grand appeal to Jupiter, but a simple, practical request to Fornax to please not let the oven get too hot on one side. This practice of targeted prayer fuels an ongoing scholarly debate about the nature of Roman piety. When the baker left a small offering at his shrine, perhaps a pinch of flour or a perfectly formed miniature loaf, what was his actual intention? Was this an act of deep personal faith and devotion, a genuine conversation with the divine forces that governed his world? Or was it something more akin to superstition, a form of spiritual insurance? Many historians argue that for the average Roman, religion was deeply transactional. The principle was do ut day. I give so that you might give. The baker made his small offering not necessarily out of love for the gods, but to keep them happy so they wouldn't interfere with his business. It was a cosmic bargain, a small loaf for Fornax in exchange for a day without burnt bread. This view presents Roman religion as less about faith and more about a set of rituals designed to maintain the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, and keep the universe running smoothly. You can't know the baker's heart, but as you watch him work near the oven, you see him glance towards the shrine. It's a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement. Is it a moment of prayer, a check to see if the lamp is still lit, or just a random tick? The gesture is ambiguous, hanging in the warm air like the flower dust itself, a silent symbol of the complex, contested relationship between the Roman worker and his gods. As the morning wears on, the first frantic rush for bread begins to subside. The flow of customers slows to a trickle, but the work of the oven is not yet done. You notice a woman enter, but she carries no dough board and holds no empty bag. Instead, she has a heavy, covered earthenware pot, which she handles with care. She approaches the baker, and after a brief, quiet exchange, he takes the pot and places it not inside the main oven, but on a lower shelf near the oven's opening, where the heat is less intense but still formidable. This is a wonderful mainstream example of Roman resourcefulness, using the residual heat of the public oven. After the primary high-heat work of baking bread was finished, the massive brick and stone structure would remain incredibly hot for hours. This was a valuable energy source, and it didn't go to waste. The baker essentially rented out his cooling oven to the community. People from the neighborhood, lacking their own cooking facilities, would bring their prepared dishes to the bistrinum to be slow cooked. This turned the baker into a part-time chef for the entire block. They would bring stews, bean porridges, and vegetable dishes to be gently simmered in the fading but still powerful heat. And this leads to some fantastically specific culinary trivia. What exactly were they cooking in those pots? One popular dish was a patina, a versatile, crustless casserole that was a staple of Roman cuisine. A savory patina might involve layers of vegetables, cheese, and perhaps some chopped fish or meat, all bound together with an egg custard. A sweet version could be made with fruit, nuts, and honey. Imagine preparing a dish in your tiny apartment, then carrying it down the street to the baker, knowing that in a few hours you would return to pick up a perfectly cooked hot meal. It was the ancient Roman version of a takeaway, a communal slow cooker. This practice, however, raises a host of questions that economic historians are still debating. How was this service priced? Was there a flat fee for any pot, regardless of size? Or was it priced by weight, or by the amount of time it needed in the oven? It's highly unlikely there was a written menu of prices for casserole cooking. These were the microtransactions that formed the bedrock of the neighborhood economy, and they were likely governed by custom, reputation, and personal relationships rather than formal rules. Some historians argue that this service might have been an informal perk for regular customers, a way for the baker to build loyalty. If you bought your bread from him every day, maybe he'd cook your bean pot for free or for a nominal charge. Others suggest it was a separate, though unadvertised, line of business. Perhaps the baker's wife or assistant managed this secondary kitchen, earning a little extra income for the family. The records are silent on these mundane details, leaving us to piece together the economic life of a neighborhood from hints and logic. You watch as another customer, a young boy, arrives with two small birds, likely sparrows or thrushes, spitted on a green stick. The baker takes them and places them on a hot stone right inside the oven's mouth. They would be roasted in minutes. The bakery was not just a bread factory. It was the neighborhood's communal grill, its oven, its microwave. It was a warm, beating heart of the community's culinary life, a place that transformed not just flour and water, but the raw ingredients of a dozen different households into their evening meals. The light slanting through the doorway is changing. The sharp white light of midday has softened into the warmer golden hue of late afternoon. The relentless, grinding sound of the mill has fallen silent. The donkey, its long day of circular toil finally over, has been unharnessed and led to a small enclosure at the back, where it stands, head bowed, occasionally twitching an ear. The frantic energy of the morning has dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm, productive finality. You are witnessing the winding down of the bakery's day. This rhythm of work, dictated by the sun, is a core feature of the ancient world. With no effective artificial lighting, the vast majority of commerce and labor ceased at sundown. As dusk approached, shops would close, and people would retreat to their homes. The streets, once teeming with life, would become quiet, their character changing as the shadows lengthened. The baker is no longer barking orders or judging dough. He moves with a slower, more deliberate pace. He and his assistant are now engaged in the essential, unglamorous work of cleaning up. One of them takes a long-handled wooden scraper and begins to pull the hot ashes and embers from the oven's floor. This isn't waste to be discarded. This leads to a final piece of practical, everyday trivia: the value of ash. The wood ash from the oven was a valuable byproduct. Rich in potash, it was a potent fertilizer and was likely sold or traded to farmers in the countryside surrounding Rome. It could also be mixed with animal fat to create a harsh, lye-based soap, a crucial cleaning agent in a world without modern detergents. In the Roman economy, almost nothing was truly thrown away. Every byproduct had a potential secondary use. The baker wasn't just cleaning his oven. He was harvesting his final product of the day. This quiet, domestic scene at the end of a long workday brings up a small but profoundly human question that historians of daily life love to ponder. What did the baker and his family eat for dinner? After a day spent creating thousands of loaves of bread for the city, what did they place on their own table? Did they, as the masters of the product, take the very best for themselves, the lightest, most perfectly formed loaves of white bread that were too expensive for most of their customers? Or did the logic of business prevail? Perhaps they sold all of the premium loaves, and like their poorer customers, ate the darker, denser, or slightly misshapen bread that was left over at the end of the day. Did they see bread as a precious food to be savored, or, after a lifetime of being immersed in it, did it become just a product, something whose value was purely commercial? There's no single answer, of course. It would have varied from baker to baker, from family to family. But the question gets to the very heart of their existence, the line where their grueling public business met their private life. When the last customer had gone and the heavy wooden door was barred for the night, did the baker finally sit down with his wife and children, break a loaf of his own bread and feel a sense of pride? Or did he just feel the deep, aching exhaustion of a man who had fed a fraction of a city and now, finally, could rest? The oven, now swept clean, radiates a gentle, fading warmth, its fiery breath softening to a sigh. You take your leave, stepping out of the warm, flower-scented air of the bakery and back into the cool evening of the Roman street. The loaf of bread in your arms feels solid, real. It's more than just food. It's a piece of the day's history, a dense tapestry of labor, social anxiety, and ancient tradition. As you walk away, the orange glow from the bakery's doorway shrinks behind you, just one of many small points of light in the vast, darkening city. You reflect on the bakery's enduring legacy. This institution, this community hub, is a mainstream and direct ancestor of so many places we know today. The village bakery in Europe, the local pizzeria in Naples, the corner coffee shop where neighbors gather all share a common DNA with the Roman pastrinum. They are places that provide not just sustenance, but a focal point for the community, a physical space for the small, daily interactions that weave a neighborhood together. The connection to one particular modern food is surprisingly direct. While the Romans obviously had no tomatoes and thus no pizza as we know it, they had something that was a clear forerunner. This is a final, fascinating piece of food history trivia. Bakers would often use the flat, hot floor of the oven, the hearth, or focus in Latin to cook simple, unleavened flatbreads. This bread was known as panis focaccius, the hearth bread. It would come out of the oven flat, chewy, and slightly smoky. It might be drizzled with olive oil, sprinkled with salt and herbs, or served with cheese and figs. This is the direct culinary ancestor of modern Italian focaccia, and by extension, the great-great-grandfather of the pizza. The journey from that Roman hearth bread to a modern slice is a long one, but the line is unbroken. This idea of continuity brings us to one of the biggest questions in all of history. What truly survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire? When the aqueducts failed and the great urban centers shrank, did this complex system of commercial baking collapse entirely? Many historians argue that it did. The highly organized system, dependent on massive grain shipments from overseas and a dense urban population, couldn't survive the political and economic fragmentation. Baking became a purely domestic, localized affair for centuries. Others argue for a more subtle continuity. They believe that the knowledge and the traditions were preserved, passed down through monasteries, which had large estates and their own bakeries, or in the villages of Italy, where the memory of Roman ways lingered. The debate is about whether the European baking tradition had to be completely reinvented during the Middle Ages, or whether it was a quiet ember preserved from the great fire of Rome fanned back to life when the time was right. The loaf in your hands suddenly feels heavier, a link in that long, contested chain of history. It's a simple thing, just flour and water and heat and salt. But it contains the echo of a donkey's patient steps, the weight of unspoken social rules, the whisper of neighborhood gossip, and the faint scent of a God's forgotten altar. It's a taste of a world that is both unimaginably distant and surprisingly, recognizably human. Now, as the sounds of the city begin to fade into a deeper quiet, the memory of the day starts to soften at the edges. The heat from the oven, the feel of the warm loaf, the low murmur of voices, it all begins to blend together into a single, peaceful sensation. The sharp details dissolve, leaving only the impression of warmth, of community, of a rhythm as old as civilization itself. The weight of the bread in your arms becomes the gentle weight of your own blanket. The dusty air of the bakery becomes the soft, still air of your own quiet room. The rhythmic grinding of the millstones transforms into the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, a peaceful, lulling sound that carries you further and further away from the waking world. There are no more choices to be made, no more social codes to decipher. The work is done, the day is over, and the story, like the city itself, is finally going to sleep. Let the lingering warmth of that ancient oven guide you gently into your dreams.